Hi, hey there, and welcome to MSL 102, Lesson 03, a team and squad tactics lesson on basic formations and movements. My name is Captain Silver Beatty. I'm an APMS with the University of Montana Grizzly Battalion, and I'm going to be taking you through this lesson today. Now, keep in mind the team and squad tactics videos that you're going to see on my page, they're all part of a bigger series. This particular lesson is actually part one of two parts related specifically to basic formations and movements at the team and squad level. On this lesson, we're just going to be focusing on individual and squad movements. On the next one that you'll want to follow along for, we're going to go more into the team and squad formations. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, you already know there's a QR code right down there in the corner. If you scan that, it's going to take you to a live website version of this exact same lesson that I'm about to lead you through. With that, you can go through at your own pace. You can actually utilize the checks on learning at the end. And there's some embedded links and videos that you can actually click on and go through on your own to get some deeper information about what we're about to talk about. So with that, here are those additional links that you can click on. There's a read ahead with some Army doctrine to really dive into some of the deeper information about this lesson. And that second link right there is actually just going to take you back to this exact same video in case you want to watch it or listen to me again. So when we're talking about basic formations and movements and things like that, why does this even matter to us? Now, if you're watching this as an ROTC cadet, MS1, maybe an MS2, you got to be thinking about the future, right? Understanding these next two lessons, so part 1 and 2, is going to help you really understand individual movement techniques, which are things that we do by ourselves, as well as things about fire team and our squad formations. Now, as a future Army officer, which really isn't as far away as you might think, you have to be able to gain a tactical advantage. And with that, you use that to lead and direct our small unit movements through routes and terrain and different formations. Really, you have to understand how these different movement techniques and types of movements and formations can be used correctly or incorrectly to get through different types of tactical missions. Now, this series of lessons is going to focus on how to move as a soldier as part of a team and part of a squad. So really dive in, maybe have a piece of paper and pen out or a Word doc off to the side. So we're going to go through quite a bit of videos and information that's really going to give you the bare minimum of what you need to know, but you're going to have to go out and actually practice these things and apply them in your different leadership labs or tactical lanes at maybe an FTX to really understand how they work. All right, so let's get our mindset into thinking about movements, formations from the idea of the enemy's point of view. With that, Walter Johnson once said, "You can't hit what you can't see." Now, how does that pertain to what we're about to talk about? Well, it was by a famous baseball player in the early 1900s. So why does it apply to us now when we're talking about individual and collective tactical movements? What does this have to do with the Army? Well, if the enemy can't see you, they can't shoot you, right? It's pretty basic. It's pretty self-explanatory. So then how do we mitigate the potential for the enemy to engage us or see us as we maneuver into our positions? Well, we use those individual movement techniques, which you'll hear me call IMTs throughout this lesson. And that's going to really depend on the situation that you find yourself in and the terrain that you're working across. So why is it so critical that we actually perfect these techniques? Now, perfection isn't just we hear about it from a lesson from Captain Beatty on YouTube and we know how to do it. It's actually going out and practicing these and understanding exactly what they're supposed to look like. Well, it keeps us alive, right? That seems pretty big. That might sound even a little cheesy or cliche, but truly understanding how to move your own body and eventually as a leader, how to move your teams and squads is going to impact your survivability and your ability in general just to complete a mission. So what do I want you to know by the time you're done watching this video with me today? Well, I need you to be able to understand and explain the difference between cover and concealment. They're two things that are slightly similar but very different at the same time. I want you to be able to describe the 3 IMTs, those individual, personal, just us, movement techniques that we implement while we're moving under direct fire. And I also need you to understand the various squad movement techniques, when to use them, and the characteristics that make them what they are. Now, you will feel pretty confident, I think, by the time you're done with this, understanding what all of that looks like. So what is cover and concealment? I'm sure you've heard those terms. I'm sure you think you know what they are, and maybe you do know exactly the difference between the two. But here are the two definitions that I want you to remember. Cover, that's your protection from the effects of direct and indirect fires. So that keeps you from being shot. Concealment, that protects you from observation, surveillance, essentially being seen. Now, which one is going to be more effective? Likely cover, right? You want cover because that stops bullets. Concealment just stops eyes. Now, there are ways to use both, but cover is what you're typically shooting for, especially if you're already being engaged by the enemy. Now, something that you'll need to learn as you're going through and actually out in the field and learning how to maneuver through different missions is how to quickly keep an eye out for good covered or concealed positions. That way, if you take a quick halt, you know exactly where you need to move. So trees, rocks, boulders. If you don't see any cover, what type of concealment can you use? Are you doing camo? That's a form of concealment. Are you able to utilize tall grass or some foliage? That's another type of concealment. It's not going to stop bullets, but it's better than nothing. All right, and a quick note when it comes to concealment. I said camo is a form of concealment. Does your program give you a camo stick? Have they trained you in how to utilize camo and that face paint? Because there's actually a technique to it. So I do recommend that you look up some videos, look into the doctrine, and find out how to actually utilize camo the proper way to make sure that you are as camouflaged and concealed as possible. Okay, so which one's more important? Probably cover, right? Concealment's great, but if you can find cover, that's what you're looking for. Now, is it possible for something to act as both cover and concealment? Well, yeah, it might be a little bit more difficult, right? It's hard to see through rocks, it's hard to see through trees, but you're being concealed and you're being covered. But we really want to try to find something that you can utilize as both. So use your brain, see if you can think of some things, and then just remember what I just said about finding and being situationally aware of what you can use for cover and concealment as you're moving through different terrains. Now, individual movement techniques. Some people love them, some people hate them. At the end of the day, you have to know how to use them. So we're going to talk about the three main ones here. We're going to go through them and understand what their purpose is and when we actually utilize them. So they're techniques that you need to use to move your body and your equipment from one place to another. And that's going to help limit your exposure to the enemy. Now, the choice of that individual movement technique really does depend on the terrain that you're in and the enemy visibility. Something that you really need to keep in mind is low profile. It's easy to conduct individual movement techniques and we think that we're covered, we think that the enemy can't see us. But remember, they have a much wider view. They are able to see far across. I promise, if you're in leadership labs, most likely the Op 4 can see you. The cadre can see you. But still, you want to keep practicing staying as low as possible. Now, what are the three types? You've probably heard these before, but what do they look like? We've got your high crawl, your low crawl, and what we call the rush, which you might also hear called the 3 to 5 second rush. Now, with the high crawl, this is what we're going to use when the route provides us some good cover concealment and poor visibility makes it so the enemy can't really see us, and we have to be a little faster. Now, if you've ever done the high crawl, you know it's not the fastest technique in the world, but it's faster than the next one, the low crawl. Now, the low crawl we're going to use when we have cover and concealment that's less than a foot high. So think about to where your knee is, and when you're in a low crawl, you're as flat as possible. So when you have cover and concealment that you can't do a high crawl in because you pop above it, that's when we go into a low crawl. Now, the low crawl, even slower than the high crawl, right? The way that you move is very slow, very deliberate across certain terrains. You also want to use this if the enemy can see you really well. Now, it's a slow movement. You're not rushing anywhere. If you're electing to use a low crawl, you have to understand that it's going to take longer. Now, that rush, or the 3 to 5 second rush, this is when the route has no cover concealment. The enemy fire will only allow you to be up for a brief amount of time, and then you have to get back down. Now, this one's fun, but also a little complicated when it comes to how you use your rifle to get down, where you go when you land, before you pop back up, the different types of calls that you're going to use, but we'll talk through all of those. So it's called the 3 to 5 second rush, and something you may have already heard is we say, I'm up, he sees me, I'm down. That amount of time to say that is about how much time you should be up and exposed before you're hitting the ground again. Which means that even though it's a rush and we're moving fast once we're up, you're not making much space for yourself. You're not getting very far each time that you're doing this technique. So it's not something that can get you 100 meters quickly. You're up, you're down. You're up, you're down. Now let's go into a little bit more detail about what these look like. So we've got the high crawl, you're kind of up on your elbows, your knees. You're still low, you're keeping a low profile, but you can move a little faster because you're not basically eating the grass as you're going. Now that low crawl there, that's going to be your face is in the dirt, in the grass. You are making your body as flat and even with the ground as you possibly can. And the rush we just talked about, you're up out of a prone spot, you're moving and you're crashing back down into another prone position. So what does that high crawl actually entail? Well, like we said, you have cover and concealment that's at least a foot high, right? Because if it's lower than that, we're going to be able to see your back, the back of your head, and your bottom moving across the grass or whatever your concealment you're using. We don't want the enemy to be able to see us, and we have to be able to move fairly quickly. So the key elements of this, you want to keep your body off the ground. You're going to put your weight on your forearms and your lower legs. You're going to cradle the weapon in your arms, keeping that muzzle off of the ground. You don't want to be dragging your muzzle and barrel into the ground where it's going to start collecting dirt and debris in there and be useless to you. You're keeping your knees well behind your butt so that you're still staying pretty low, and you're moving forward by alternately advancing your right elbow and your left knee and vice versa. Okay, it's great. Ma'am, I can see a small circle of you in a corner, kind of sort of doing this, but what does it actually look like? Let's take a look.
Keep your body off the ground. Rest your weight on your forearms and lower legs. Cradle your weapon in your arms, keeping its muzzle off the ground. Keep your knees well behind your buttocks so it stays low. Move forward by alternately advancing your right elbow and left knee, and left elbow and right knee.
Now the low crawl. You are low, you don't have cover and concealment more than a foot high. So you're staying as low as you possibly can. We also use this if the visibility makes it so that the enemy can see us really well, and we have to stay as stealth as possible. We also don't want to use this if we need to be fast. If we have to be fast, the low crawl is not the way. You might think you're fast with the low crawl in your uniform, but once you put all your gear on and you've got a weapon that you're going with, it's going to take a little bit more time. So how do we actually do this? Well, keep your body as flat to the ground as you absolutely can. You're going to hold your weapon kind of funky. Now, I'm going to show you a video after this so you can see what I'm talking about, but you're going to grasp the sling at the upper sling swivel. You're going to let your hand guard rest on your forearm, and the butt of the weapon is going to drag back behind you on the ground. Again, keeping the muzzle off the ground. Do not get that muzzle in there and get it jammed with a bunch of debris. So you're pulling kind of in a Superman movement, and you're just slowly going across. Now you're going to change your legs as much as you need to back and forth. Again, this is a slow movement. All right, so let's check out what this actually looks like.
Keep your body as flat as possible to the ground. Hold your weapon by grasping the sling at the upper sling swivel, letting the hand guard rest on your forearm and the butt of the weapon drag on the ground, thus keeping the muzzle off the ground. Move forward by first pushing both arms forward and pulling your right leg forward, then pulling with both arms and pushing with your right leg. Continue this push-pull method, changing legs as necessary until you reach your next position.
All right, remember that rush, 3 to 5 seconds. I'm up, he sees me, I'm down. This is a more complicated movement than it seems. And we use this when we cannot use any cover and concealment. We have to get somewhere quick, but the enemy is firing on us, so we can only be up for a certain amount of time. How do we do this? Well, you're going to roll or crawl away from your current fighting position. Now, if you're being shot at, you should already be flat to the ground and in some sort of prone position, right? Before you move, before you pop up and run, you have to roll or crawl to a separate position. Now, why? I use this analogy a lot in my classes. If you've ever played a video game and you can't stand campers, it's because they know exactly where you're going to land, where you're going to respawn, right? And they can just take you right out. Now, I hated those too when I played. So don't be able to respawn and have a camper just take you right out. You're going to roll or crawl, depending on what type of gear you're carrying, a few feet away so that you pop up in a different position than where they expect you to. Kind of that element of surprise. Now, in order to get up, you're going to pop up. Think of sprint, drag, carry. You're going to raise your body, straightening your arms, and springing to your feet as fast as you can. You're going to run to your next position, keeping the distance short. Remember, in your head, just say, I'm up, he sees me, I'm down. And you're not going to stay on your feet more than those 3 to 5 seconds. That way the enemy can't track you with their automatic fire. Or if you're moving for longer than 5 seconds, it's too easy to just put that muzzle on you from afar and follow you and track you. You want to get up and down before they can really get a good target on you. Now, in that time that you're up, you better be thinking about how you're going to land. In order to land, you've got to plant both of your feet. You're going to grasp the heel of the butt of your weapon, and you're going to use that to break your fall falling forward. Now, as soon as you get down, you're pulling your weapon into a firing position. Hopefully you're in a covered location or as low and flat as possible, and you're going to cover your buddy's movement because this is an individual movement technique, but everybody's doing it, so we could also be calling it the buddy rush. And in order to do that, you're going to yell things out like, cover me while I move. Your buddy would say, I've got your cover. You're then up, moving down. You can say down. Maybe your unit has a different SOP for what to say, ready. Then your buddy is going to yell, cover me while I move. I've got your cover, because then you are covering them so that they can move for that 3 to 5 seconds. And you're doing that over and over and over again until you get out of that terrain or you're in a safe position. Now, let's watch what this actually looks like in an animated way.
Roll or crawl away from your current firing position. Raise your body by straightening your arms and springing to your feet. Run to your next position, keeping the distance short and trying not to stay on your feet longer than 3 to 5 seconds so the enemy cannot track you with automatic fire or bring accurate fire onto you. Plant both feet just before hitting the ground and fall forward by grasping the heel of the butt of your weapon and using the butt of your weapon to break your fall. Assume a firing position in a covered location if possible, and cover your buddy's movement.
So I've talked through them, you've seen them. How does enemy accuracy actually influence the action that we're taking? So how does their accuracy on us influence what we're going to do with these IMTs? Well, if it's from a really far distance or it's inaccurate, you might be able to just move through quickly, doing those 3 to 5 second rushes. If the enemy's fire is close and somewhat accurate or it's effective on your area, you might need to high crawl out of there because you need to get out fast. Now, if you're receiving close, accurate, effective fire, to survive, you have to give the enemy the smallest target possible. And that includes low crawling to the nearest cover. Now that brings me back to the cover and concealment. All of these movements, you are trying to get to better cover. So when you're doing those 3 to 5 second rushes, if the terrain allows, when you're landing, you should be landing near cover. You don't want to still just be out there open in a flat area. So always, always be looking for the next covered position that you can utilize if necessary. So we just talked this with buddy rushes also, right? You're doing this as a team, but they're individual techniques. How do you make sure that the people around you know what you're doing? Well, you got to communicate it, especially with your buddy, your battle buddy to your left or right. You need to be talking about what you're doing. If you're doing these movements, a lot of time there's already fire happening, so it's not like you have to be super quiet, right? You need to be communicating so people know where you are and what the next move is. That way you can get covered while you're making these movements. Now, in that term of covered, that means somebody is actually watching your back and making sure they're taking anybody out that might pop up and take aim at you. Then you get into a covered position, you're covering people so they can then move. Now, if you're moving as a member of a fire team, keep in mind that your team leader is going to select your route and they're going to control the covering fire. So you need to be listening for that. If you're an MS1, listen to your team leader. Listen to what they're telling you to do. Stay with that team leader, follow their example and their directions. All right, there you have it. Congratulations, you are now an expert in individual movement techniques. So now let's talk squad movement techniques. Now don't worry, we're not going to talk about high crawl, low crawl rushes anymore. This is actually referring more to the dispersion between soldiers or just how we're going to move our different elements through an area of space. Now, because these are squad movement techniques, the choice on which one you're going to use is actually based on the platoon leader's decision. So all you need to do with these is understand what they are and then listen for what you're being told either during an op ward or signaled during an actual maneuver. Now, I've noticed during my time, and even when I was a cadet, I used to think that these three terms we're going to talk about were actual formations. They're not. Don't get them confused with different squad and team formation types, which are going to come in video 2. This is just a type of movement within that formation. Now, the choice on these is going to depend on some factors the platoon leader has to take into account. And those include your control, your dispersion, your speed, and the level of security that you need while you're moving through a certain space. So let's talk about what these actually are. So the three types of squad movement techniques are traveling, traveling overwatch, and bounding overwatch. Now, these three pictures right here are going to show you about the distance or the style of movement that you can expect within the three of these. They're far more basic than they may seem. Traveling, you're moving a little bit closer together. It's kind of our typical go-to default way of moving through terrain. Traveling overwatch, we're actually dispersing our units further apart, up to 50-ish meters, give or take. Bounding is actually, instead of moving forward like this, following each other, we're actually moving an element in different ways. Now, there are two types of bounding overwatch that we'll talk about in just a moment. So let's do a quick overview of what squad movement techniques are actually all about. What do we use them for? What's the purpose of this?
Movement techniques are the position of your squads and fire teams in relation to each other while moving. There are three movement techniques: traveling, traveling overwatch, and bounding overwatch. Like formations, movement techniques provide your unit with varying degrees of control, security, and flexibility.
Okay, so now we have an overview. We understand what squad movement techniques are. Now might be the time to take some notes. So let's talk traveling. Traveling is simple. Like I said, it's more the default movement technique that we use in squads. Now, this is when we need speed, we need to be quick, and we're not expecting any contact with the enemy. Now, with those characteristics that a platoon leader has to take into account when deciding on this movement technique, that control, which is referring to the element leader's ability to control their subordinate leaders. So you can see in this photo, the squad leader is fairly close to both team leaders. Therefore, this movement technique has more control. The dispersion is less. There's only 20-ish meters between fire teams, so they're not as spread out. That's what dispersion is referring to. The speed, you can move quick because you can communicate quickly and move. You're closer together. It's just follow the leader style. But your security, that's not going to be super great just because you're moving fast and you're closer together. Now, we want to be more spread out for security reasons when we feel we need a higher level of security. Notice with traveling, we're not expecting any enemy contact. Therefore, our security levels don't have to be quite as high. So here's a very quick video showing and explaining traveling in just a little bit more detail.
The squad traveling formation is used when enemy contact is not likely. The travel technique offers the best speed and control during maneuver, but offers the least dispersion and security because the trail team follows closely behind the lead fire team. Because teams are closer during movement, the travel technique is easier for the squad leader to control. It is not normally used in enemy territory.
Okay, so now let's talk traveling overwatch. What does that look like? Well, it's a lot like traveling, just a little bit more spread out. We want to use this when speed is somewhat necessary, but also use this when contact with the enemy is possible. So think about things like movement to contact. It's possible and likely even that we're going to expect getting some enemy engagement. So with that, going into the characteristics, you can see the control is going to be just a little bit less because people are spread out more, which means the dispersion is going to be more, spreading people out further distances. Your speed is going to be just a little bit slower because you want to be more aware and alert of your surroundings because enemy contact is more possible, right? And then the security, it's a lot more just because you have a bigger footprint. So you're able to secure more space around you. So let's watch this quick demonstration of what traveling overwatch would look like.
Traveling overwatch is used when enemy contact is possible, but the squad must move quickly to accomplish the mission. The lead fire team is pushed out further, approximately 50 meters, so that if contact is made with the enemy, the squad leader can limit that contact to the lead fire team. This allows the squad leader to maneuver the trail fire team around the lead team without the maneuver team being engaged by the enemy.
All right, and the last one, let's talk bounding overwatch. Now, I'll be honest, this one, even when I was a cadet and maybe into my early officer years, was a little bit more confusing to me. I understood the concept of bounding, I understood the concept of overwatch, but I couldn't quite figure out how they worked together, especially realizing that there was two different types. So we use bounding overwatch when speed is necessary, contact with the enemy is expected, or there's an open danger area that has to be crossed. We move quickly through that because we don't want to be exposed, right? Now there are two different methods, like I said. We have the alternate bounds and we have successive bounds. That's going to be determined by the platoon leader. Just do what you're told and understand how to do each one. Now with the characteristics, you can see that this has the most control, and it has to, because the leader of the element is maneuvering multiple teams or groups at the same time. You have to be able to control that movement really well. Now the dispersion, it's going to be the most because you're actually moving people far apart. The speed is actually slower because you're not moving all at once, you're moving in pieces together. And security, this has the most because you actually have half of the element pulling security for the maneuvering element. Now maybe that felt like a lot of information, or maybe this concept just makes perfect sense to you. Either way, let's take a quick look at what bounding overwatch is.
Bounding overwatch is used when contact with an enemy force is expected or when crossing a large open danger area. One fire team is always in an overwatch position, prepared to lay down a base of fire while the other fire team maneuvers. This is the slowest movement technique and the most difficult to control, but it provides the best dispersion and fire control. When contact is made, the fire team in contact becomes the base of fire team to destroy or suppress the enemy. The fire team not in contact maneuvers to destroy the enemy. If the squad leader decides to break contact, the fire team not in contact occupies a support by fire position where it can direct fire on the enemy force. This allows the fire team in contact to disengage and fall back to a covered and concealed position. They provide covering fire while the other fire team disengages. This process continues until the squad successfully breaks contact with the enemy.
Okay, so that's bounding overwatch, and there's two types, right? There's the successive bound, and there's the alternate bound. With successive bounds, teams are bounding and remaining parallel to each other. With alternate bounds, the teams are just bounding ahead of each other as they go, so kind of leapfrogging. Now let's watch the difference between successive and alternate bounding and what they look like during that maneuver.
In the successive bound, the teams bound forward to a covered and concealed position, generally parallel with the other teams. In the alternate bound, the bounding fire team does not stop parallel with the overwatch fire team, but moves beyond the overwatch fire team. Bounding overwatch provides the most control, the most dispersion, and the most security, but at the cost of speed.
All right, now take a deep breath with me. That was a lot of information, and that was only talking about movements. We still have a whole nother video to check out that talks about our formations, where we'll actually utilize these movements. But first, let's see how much you caught from this lesson. So what between cover and concealment actually protects us from the effects of direct and indirect fires? Basically, which one keeps us safe from bullets? If you said cover, you're absolutely right. If you said both, it depends. Is your concealment also some sort of cover? So remember, concealment just stops you from being seen. Okay, that was an easy one. Let's talk our individual movement techniques. Which one do we use when speed's not required and our cover concealment is less than a foot high. Is that going to be your high crawl, your low crawl, or your rush? Low crawl. It's going to be your low crawl. That's one where we're getting as flat as possible, and it's not a quick movement at all. Okay, now the hardest one of all of them. Which of those factors below does a platoon leader have to consider when they're determining which squad movement technique they're going to implement? Control, security, speed, dispersion, or is it all of the above? That's right, it's all of the above. They have to take into account what kind of control they need, the security they're going to need in that area, how fast they need to go, and how far apart their people can be. All right, very good. Now I hope that you feel a little bit more confident with those learning objectives we talked about at the beginning. Can you understand and explain the difference between cover and concealment? One stops bullets, one stops you from being seen. Can you describe those 3 individual movement techniques that we implement while we're moving under fire? Essentially, remember, they're high crawl, low crawl, and the rush. And do you understand the various squad movement techniques, when to use them, and their characteristics of control, dispersion, speed, and security? Remember, those are traveling overwatch, and bounding overwatch, which can be done in alternate and successive bounds. Now, if any of this information still brings about questions or you don't quite understand it, I highly recommend you go find your own ROTC advisor or instructor, maybe a high-speed MS3 or an MS4, and get those questions answered so that you can be a better part of a maneuvering fire team and squad. Now your next challenge, either before you watch the formations video or after, is to get out there and practice these, especially the high crawl, low crawl, and that 3 to 5 second rush. If you haven't done them before, I highly recommend you just start with shorts and a t-shirt, hoodie and some sweats, and do it in that attire, then move into doing it with your uniform, then do it with moving into having an assault pack and a flick and a Kevlar, maybe a dummy rifle, and get those muscle memories going. Because you don't want to be learning how to do this out in the field when your MS3 leader really needs you to be moving in the right way. As always, I appreciate your time watching this video. I hope you're walking away with some additional information that you didn't already know, and make sure that you're following along for part 2 when we're going to talk about the team and squad formations. All right, I'll see you on the next one.